Hi again. This is the second mini lecture on Plato's Phaedrus. I'm Adam Melwanger, professor of rhetoric at University of Houston downtown. In the first part of this video, we talked about how the Platonic dialogue creates an association between love and rhetoric. And both love and rhetoric come under criticism by Socrates in the dialogue, particularly because they have a capacity to lead to excess. There's a theme of the entrancing nature of both of these things, the way they can enchant an audience. And in that condition of enchantment, we are easily manipulated or led to behave in ways that might not conform to the good or the ideal. I want to introduce here that all of this connects to another theme of transformation, personal transformation. And this is a concern of Socrates in the dialogue, right? He recognizes that even though the speech was bad, the speech that Phaedrus read by Lysias, he was enchanted by it. Right, enchanted by watching Phaedrus deliver the speech. And he knows that rhetoric, similarly, has the possibility to enchant an audience. And this transforms him. Right? As we see, Socrates did not think Lysias' speech was good. And in terms of formal conventions, it was a well-composed speech. But he's very critical that there's no substance there. It seems to elevate style over substance. And yet, even though it's not a good speech in his eyes, it has a profound influence on Socrates. One that he feels he must resist. Self-restraint. And so, we pick up the dialogue, right, where Socrates has just said, wow, in this entranced state, I almost feel like I could give a speech that's as good as the one by Lysias on the same topic. And again, the topic of Lysias' speech is that it's better to engage in intimacy with someone who doesn't love you than with someone who does. Now, Socrates doesn't believe that claim is true. And yet the fact that his enchantment makes him willing to deliver a speech that is untrue of his own shows the way that both the speech itself as rhetoric and his attraction to Phaedrus in this moment, this idyllic setting that they're in, makes him willing to transform himself. And this is familiar to us. You know, if you've ever heard a very persuasive speaker speak, you can become enchanted and somehow you are changed, right, as a person, because you changed what you think or whatever. Or if you've been in love, right, you know that you're also willing to change who you are for that person. If you think that doing something different might make that person happy or pleasure, you're willing to change how you do things, right? And that shows the enchanting power of this, that both love and rhetoric work to conquer the self. And that is part of the critique that Plato and Socrates give of rhetoric. So let's look now at this moment when Socrates sets out on this attempt, the second speech. If you notice, the dialogue is composed of three speeches: the original speech by Lysias, the response speech that Socrates gives, which repeats the claims of Lysias' speech but seeks to improve on them. Right? And then there's the third speech, where Socrates actually says what he thinks. So let's look at the second speech, right? And actually, Phaedrus forces him to give it, right? But because of his love for Phaedrus, and because of Phaedrus' rhetoric, Socrates is ultimately convinced to give the speech that he doesn't want to give. And so finally, before he begins his speech, he says, I'm going to keep my head wrapped up while I talk, that I can get through my discourse as quickly as possible, and that I might not look at you and become embarrassed. He's partly embarrassed because, it's embarrassing to give a speech, right? But most of his embarrassment is coming from the fact that he's being forced to discourse on a topic that he thinks is untrue, right? That is, that it's better to engage with the non-lover than with the lover. So, Socrates does improve to some degree on Lysias' speech. For example, he kind of writes Lysias and Phaedrus into his speech. He says, "Now there was once upon a time a boy, or rather a stripling, of great beauty, and he had many lovers. And among these was one of peculiar craftiness, who was as much in love with the boy as anyone, but had made him believe that he was not in love. And once in wooing him, he tried to persuade him of this very thing, that favors ought to be granted rather to the non-lover than to the lover," right? And so he kind of uses this anecdote to talk about Lysias' real plan, which was to seduce Phaedrus by pretending that he doesn't love him, and then saying, well, you should grant favors to the people who don't love you. It's also important to note that Socrates begins his speech with an attempt to define what love is. And this is very characteristic of Plato's thinking and Aristotle's thinking also, that definitions come first, right? That we have to make sure that we are both talking about the same thing. So before we talk about, well, should you give in to the non-lover or the lover, right? We need to talk about what is love, right? So he offers that definition of love, and the definition that he gives is that it's the desire which overcomes the rational opinion that strives towards the right or the good, and which is led away toward the enjoyment of beauty, and again is strongly forced by the desires that are kindred to itself toward personal beauty. When it gains the victory, it takes its name from that very force, and that's called love. Right? And so again, what love is in this characterization is a kind of mental illness, really. One where the good horse of the soul, self-restraint, is overcome by the bad horse, which drives us towards excess, causes us to act rashly. And Socrates notes, again, when he pauses here in the middle of his speech, that he's still very much entranced, and he says, "Listen to me in silence, for this place we're in seems filled with a divine presence. So don't be surprised if I often seem to be in a frenzy as my discourse progresses, for I'm already almost uttering dithyrambics." Right? He's saying, I'm almost already speaking in poetry because I'm so enchanted by this place and by you and by these ideas and speeches that we're talking about. Phaedrus says, that's very true. And Socrates again says, you are responsible for that, to Phaedrus. And in other words, again, we come back to this idea that it's not that they're talking about like true things, right? It's that Socrates has become enchanted by Phaedrus, right? Not by what he's saying, right? And that this is manipulating him into this sort of enchanted state where he can speak in poetry because this object of his love is there. Let's continue. The reasons that Socrates offers for why the lover is inferior to the non-lover are very similar to the ones that Lysias offered, but they do differ somewhat. And he offers some more reasons. But he wraps up his speech, and Phaedrus says, "But I thought you were in the middle of it, and would say as much about the non-lover as you said about the lover, set forth all his good points, and show that he ought to be favored. So now, Socrates, why did you stop?" And Socrates says, "Did you notice, my friend, that I'm already speaking in hexameters, not mere dithyrambics, even though I'm finding fault with the lover? But if I begin to praise the non-lover, what kind of hymn do you suppose I shall raise? I shall surely be possessed of the nymphs to whom you purposely exposed me." And so he's reluctant, he's fearful to go further in this speech because he feels himself getting more and more deeply entwined and going further down the bad road to excess. both in terms of rhetorical excess, giving a speech that's overly about style and poetics rather than substance and truth, but also towards excess in the sense that the seduction seems to be moving along, right? So much so that he says, after he finishes his speech, Socrates says, "Where's the youth to whom I was speaking? He must hear this also, because if he doesn't hear it, he might accept a non-lover before we could stop him." And Phaedrus says to Socrates, "Here he is, always close at hand whenever you want him," right? Which is basically just an invitation to sex, right? That's where that is. But Socrates is still bent on pursuing the restraint, right? He's not going to give in, and for that reason, he's trying to break himself out of this spell by stopping his speech and by not saying things that he doesn't believe. Let's see. At this point in the dialogue, there's the fundamental break, right, where Socrates kind of wakes up, right, and he rejects this bewitching. So Socrates or Phaedrus asks again, right? Did you think that this was a good speech, right? And Socrates says, "Phaedrus, it was a dreadful speech. And another dreadful speech, the one that you brought before the one that you made me speak." Phaedrus says, "How so?" Right? How are they dreadful? Socrates says, "It was foolish and somewhat impious. What could be more dreadful than that?" "Nothing, if you're right about it," says Phaedrus. "Well, don't you believe that love is the son of Aphrodite and is a god?" Phaedrus says, "So it's said." "Yes, but not by Lysias, nor by your speech, which was spoken by you through my mouth that you bewitched." And so essentially what he's going on to say is that, the God of love is what controls love, and of course the lover is a superior object to give your affection to than the non-lover, right? Of course it makes sense to be with people who love you and not with people who don't love you. And so he's concerned that he is first speaking non-truth and a truth that would offend the gods, right? And he criticizes it, right? He says, if love is, as indeed he is, a god or something divine, he can't be anything evil. But the two speeches just now said that he was evil. So then they sinned against love, but their foolishness was really very funny anyway, because while they weren't saying anything sound or true, they put on airs as though they amounted to something. So again, the style over the substance of sophistic rhetoric and just of popular tastes in oratory, right? That they don't care about the truth, they just want a display of beautiful language. So now comes an interesting part, and essentially Socrates repents, and he says, "Now I will be wiser in this point. Before suffering any punishment for speaking wrongly of love, I'll try to atone by my recantation, with my head bare this time, not as before, covered though with shame." All right, so I want to talk for a minute about this recanting and this atonement, because it ties in with this concept of metanoia. Now, metanoia means afterthought, right? That's literally the meaning, to think again, right? And as we'll talk about this semester, there are a bunch of different guises that metanoia wears over the course of history. But in this pre-Christian period of ancient Greece, metanoia has a meaning in rhetorical theory of amending speech, right? Taking back what you said. And often this is substitutive speech, substitutes. It takes one thing that was erroneous, says you're taking it back, and replaces it with another statement that's presumably closer to the truth, and so that amends the fault of the wrongful speech. And so what we have here is an instance where Socrates, and by extension Plato, is achieving this type of metanoia in this recantation, the taking back of the speech. Now, interestingly, why does he take it back? As an act of atonement. An act of atonement, right? Now, later on, as we get into the Christian era, metanoia takes on connotations of atonement and penance in very pronounced ways. But we see here that even prior to Christianity and the culture that emanates from it, metanoia already had a moral, penitential dimension to it. And I think that's important. Now, metanoia is a means to transform the self, right? To transform the self, to become something other. When I say something wrong, and then I say, you know what? That was wrong. I'm going to replace it with something else. That isn't simply saying something different. What it is showing that I'm in some way a different kind of person than my earlier speech showed. And so, Socrates' decision to engage in this recantation of the earlier speech that he gave, right, is in connection to the theme of the dialogue of transformation, right? Socrates recognizes that in giving that speech that didn't accurately represent the truth or his own beliefs and convictions, he himself was in some way not just speaking things he didn't believe. He himself was transformed. And that enchantment that he was feeling was a product of that transformational process. So, in pursuing this recantation, this taking back and atoning for the earlier wrongful speech, he's trying to return to the ethos, the identity, the person who he knows he is, and not be carried away. And so, he gives the third speech, and again, interestingly, and this happens in Plato sometimes, right, is that Socrates becomes overwhelmed and ends up giving a very long monologue, which seems at odds with the dialectical method, which depends on this exchange and conversation. And I won't spend too long going into the details of the third speech, but it's important that the theme of the speech is why the lover is superior to the non-lover, right? And so it's this substitution of the earlier claim with the more truthful claim that forms the essence of rhetorical metanoia and the way we could signify personal transformations in speech to other people. So, what I'm more interested in for our purposes is the discussion of rhetoric that comes after the third speech. So, let me go to that part. Another interesting point in passing is that on 155, Socrates concedes, then that is clear to all, that writing speeches is not in itself a disgrace. Right? Phaedrus says, how can that be? Socrates says, but the disgrace, I fancy, consists in speaking or writing not well, but disgracefully and badly. This differs somewhat with the position that Socrates takes in the dialogue called Gorgias, where he suggests kind of that people who make their money as logographers or sophists are just inherently corrupt. Here he seems to allow for, professional rhetoricians. But it seems to him that the status, one's moral status as a rhetorician, is not linked to how beautiful a speech you can write. It's linked to what is it that you're saying. Right, and how well does it conform with the good and the ideal and the true, the episteme, to put it briefly. Okay, so I am going to stop this and start another video, and we will conclude our conversation. Well, it's not really a conversation. I wish it was. I wish that there was some audience here so that you all could give me some feedback. That's one thing I'm learning about sort of monologic lecturing, when you're not here to say, Adam, you're wrong about this and that. And then we can have this exchange. It's very difficult when I'm just talking to a computer sitting on a chair and you're not here. I miss you. I love you. Okay, so I'm going to stop the video, then I'll start another one that concludes my monologue on Phaedrus. Thanks.